Hello, everyone. This is Kelly Barner, owner of Buyers Meeting Point, and your host for this episode of the Source One podcast. Thanks for joining us today. Now, definitions of tail spend vary from organization to organization. Some draw a clear line and define their tail as the 20% of spend covered by 80% of their suppliers. Others designate all off-contract purchases as tail spend, and yet still others use the term to define their entire profile of indirect spend. Now, however organizations define tail spend, most are consistent in terms of how they approach it. Simply put, they don't usually treat it with the level of attention that they ought to. So today I'm joined by Anthony Mignona, a director at Source One, a core-centric company, and an advocate for more proactive strategic tail spend management. Welcome, Anthony.
Hey, Kelly.
So in my opening comments, I raised the issue that maybe the biggest problem with regard to bringing tail spend management under management is that we don't have one standard definition for what it means. So before we get into the details of exactly how procurement should manage their tail spend, would you mind starting us off by sharing your definition?
Yeah, sure. I think organizations are going to vary based on how they view their spend and how they manage their spend and what they consider the quote unquote tail. In most organizations, I would say it's the Pareto principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
The 20% of your spend that's got 80% of your suppliers. So a lot of low dollar, high volume, high transaction count, high supplier count type spend that's currently unmanaged. And depending on where you are as an organization from a procurement standpoint, that unmanaged spend might be, to your point, all of your indirect spend, or it might be 10% that procurement hasn't gotten to and likely never will. Either way, it's certainly an area worth paying attention to because those little transactions add up to a lot from a spend standpoint, but also all of those transactions and all those suppliers add up to a lot from a AP procurement processing standpoint as well.
Now, one of the things that you said that actually kind of strikes a chord with me is that how an organization views their tail spend absolutely affects how they manage it. And I think with regard to tail spend, most procurement teams look at their tail and they think, oh, it's such a mess. And that mindset, that perspective of how they see it usually leads to a less than enthusiastic level of energy when it comes to addressing it. So what would you say the average sort of either typically managed or unmanaged or poorly managed tail of spend looks like?
Yeah, and I think it's kind of necessarily looked at it that way, right? If you've got $100 million in spend, the last $10 million is probably not worth paying attention to for you as Mr. Procurement individual or Mrs. Procurement individual. It doesn't have a high enough ROI comparative to the other spend that you're responsible for managing. So in certain organizations, it just goes unmanaged, which has some of those downstream effects that I mentioned around just the AP processing and the procurement processing cost. In others, it lands on a P card somewhere, which is fine for some of it, probably not for other components of it, or you've got, a buying desk just churning out kind of a 3 bids and a cloud of dust process for some threshold of spend that may or may not be adding value. So it's kind of the redheaded stepchild within the organization, right? A lot of effort, little value add. But if you actually look at it in a vacuum, there is some opportunity there, but it's just relative to the opportunities elsewhere for a procurement organization to pay attention to it.
Yeah, no, and you make a good point. It's so characteristically procurement that, we're so quantitative in terms of how we approach everything that, of course, we look at this big pile of messy, unstructured spend that looks like it's going to take 1,000,000 years to even get straight, let alone bring under management. And so what's the reason we give for not taking action? We say, oh, the ROI is not there. Finance will completely buy this rationale for not investing more time in this spend. But unfortunately, that assumes, right? It assumes that the ROI isn't there just because it isn't quite as easy to see. And it also assumes that there isn't maybe an unprotected side that's being left there. So while we usually first and foremost express concern about the upside or lack of upside associated with investing and managing the tail, there may in fact be a downside to not doing so. What would you say are the potential implications of allowing an unmanaged tail to fester?
If you take tail spend and make it its own category, it becomes significant, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a chunk of spend there. Within that, there's likely some missed opportunities, whether it's smaller categories that you can get some benefit out of managing, or whether it's compliance issues that you're not seeing. I think a lot of times the issue with tail is just the visibility. Is it, if you can't see it, you don't know how to fix it. So getting visibility is kind of step one to controlling it, and once you do, you can start to find some of those opportunities. But letting it go unmanaged, it means you're missing those opportunities. You're getting a proliferated supply base, which increases the cost to manage it for those that got to onboard suppliers and pay them, and then also introduces risk, right, with the number of suppliers that you're doing business with. So you're missing the supplier consolidation opportunities. It just costs a lot to process that, right? If you think of kind of the full rec to pay process for a new item, new supplier, there's opportunities to try to get that cost down as well, just, because it's kind of the necessary evil, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I guess then, given what we've already talked about, if we had an objective today to this conversation, I would say is that it's probably to help others in the procurement space understand that their tail spend, regardless of how messy or labor intensive it seems, that the fact of the matter is it's not a lost cause. There is opportunity there. There are different ways to approach it. There is some positive impact that can be had. So in terms of the work that either you've done or that you've observed leading companies putting into place, what best practices have you seen procurement teams employ to bring their tail spend under management?
A lot of times when people think tail spend management, they think of like a buying desk, right? Mm-hmm. Of just, all right, when I need something, I need somebody that's going to go run a free bid and a buy process, or they're going to place a PO because I know who I need to buy it from and I know how much it costs. Yeah. And that's certainly relevant, but I don't think that putting 100% of your tail spend through that process is necessarily the right approach. I think there's if you treat tail spend like a category, right? Look at it in a vacuum as a category. I think there's an opportunity to go through a spend analysis process and identify where are these micro categories that I can source, right? Where there's recurring spend with similar suppliers, similar items, that, maybe we can put on a catalog, right? And that catalog, therefore, we might not get a whole lot of benefit from negotiating it. Maybe we'll get some, sure. But that catalog will streamline the processing and consolidate those suppliers. Where are there opportunities to leverage GPOs? I think there's kind of the stigma out there that GPOs are for small companies. Mm-hmm. Really, GPOs can be leveraged in big companies for small spends, right? Sure. And that's an opportunity to kind of get some of that spend under control, get some benefit on that spend, and then also reduce some of the processing costs. I think there's certainly an opportunity to consolidate some of those payments. So when you think of GPOs or consolidating the supply base, there's also solutions out there that help consolidate the payments. So again, a lot of those processing costs are because you have so many suppliers that you're managing through that tail spend process that just paying them all is a significant lift for your AP department. It's kind of the 20% of your spend, 80% of your suppliers, but also 80% of your time from an AP standpoint. Whatever that delta is that you can't automate, that's non-recurring, that's where you can put in those types of buying desk solutions, whether you kind of build that within your organization or outsource that, right, to more of a BPO type solution. And then, obviously, if you don't have a P2P in place that can automate some of that processing, kind of underpinning that program with technology that can help move all those things along faster in an automated fashion. And this way, you're really just managing exceptions, right? You're managing exceptions as far as what you need to actually bid out. You're managing exceptions as far as what you actually need to touch from a processing standpoint.
So then if we go back to our own sort of exception that we put out there, saying that the most common justification for not investing more time and effort and energy and bringing the tail under spend management is that it's a lost cause, especially from an ROI perspective. You've presented a whole bunch of different ways, either perspectives of looking at that spend or technology or service related approaches to bringing it under management and finding the opportunity and putting a little bit of structure and governance in place. Can we say then that there is an ROI and maybe it's not like a straight savings based, there may be value oriented opportunities. What are the benefits associated with having a well managed tail?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have kind of that singular view of my time as a procurement person, category manager, and my goal of just savings, it looks like there's not a lot of ROI, right? Because, I don't want to spend time on it, and I'm not going to save enough money on it, and that's how I'm being measured. But when you look at the amount of time that the organization is spending on tail, it's significant. There is kind of a justification for investing some time up front to reduce that time downstream. And, I think that there is some opportunities from a savings standpoint, because a lot of the tail ends up just being non-compliance for something you actually sourced, right?
Right.
As you kind of aggregate and consolidate, there's some savings there, right? Savings might not be hard dollar, but it might be in improved supplier relationships. It might be just in improved processing costs. It might be resource reduction, right? Ultimately, you're trying to get the organization to be able to focus on what they need to be focusing on, and not so much on just pushing these tail spend items through kind of a manual transaction process.
No, absolutely. And to some extent, some of the work that every function does, whether we're talking about procurement, marketing, operations, sales, right? There's always some amount of work that simply has to be done for the sake of being complete and thorough. And I think in the case of tail spend, it does bring to mind the idea of that final mile from logistics. It's the most complex, it's the most costly, and yet if you don't complete it, none of us are going to be happy if the small parcel delivery service just tosses our package down at the end of the street rather than bring it to our home or office building because they say, it was so far down the street, it was going to take me a lot of time and I'm not sure there's any ROI in it. You still have to complete the transaction, seal the deal, and keep an eye on all of the details. So clearly it's about changing that perspective, as you mentioned, how you look at it, having a positive attitude, approaching it with an open mind that there is something to be gained by bringing the tail under management. And then also considering the entire range of ways that can be accomplished, whether it's GPOs, whether it's automation, whether it's a tactical buying desk, whether it's sorting out compliance problems, or partnering with somebody from a service perspective that has a discipline that they can use to take that process through completion because they've helped other companies do the same and bring their tails under management. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights into what seems like an unruly tail, but actually may just be hidden opportunity.
Thanks, Kelly. Appreciate it.
And thank you as well to all of you listeners joining us today for this episode of the Source One podcast. To learn more about Source One and their approach to tail spend management, visit sourceoneinc.com. That's sourceoneinc.com.